In the heart of a vast rolling valley surrounded by towering mountains, there lived a village where the people lived by the traditions passed down for generations. The village was ruled by a strong and wise chief named Tahoma. He was respected by all the people, not just for his leadership but for his fairness and wisdom. Chief Tahoma's daughter Sequoia was his pride. She was as beautiful as the land around them. With long, dark hair and bright, intelligent eyes, she had a heart full of hope and a spirit that seemed unbreakable. Sequoia was raised to be as strong as the people of the village, and she was well loved by everyone. Sequoia's life had always been full of promise. From a young age, she had shown leadership skills just like her father. She was learning the ways of her people, from hunting to the art of negotiation, and she was seen as someone who would one day carry on her father's legacy. She wasn't just the chief's daughter. She was a leader in her own right. People often said that she would be the one to lead the village into a brighter future. But everything changed one fateful night. A violent raid from a neighboring tribe shook the village to its core. The attack was swift and brutal with no warning, and it left destruction in its wake. The villagers fought bravely, but the attackers outnumbered them, and soon the village was overrun. Chief Tahoma, who had always been at the front lines, fought fiercely to protect his people, but in the chaos, tragedy struck. Sequoia had been with her father that night, standing by his side as they tried to defend the village. In the middle of the battle, a cruel strike from one of the attackers left her paralyzed from the waist down. The pain was excruciating, but worse than the physical pain was the weight of the injury that would change her life forever. She could no longer run, no longer hunt, no longer do the things she had once dreamed of doing. The raid ended in defeat for the village, and the attackers left, leaving the villagers broken. Chief Tahoma was injured, but not fatally. However, his mind was shattered by what had happened. His daughter, the one he had always believed would follow in his footsteps, was now confined to a wheelchair. He could no longer see her as the strong young woman she had once been. The image of her lying in pain, unable to walk or run, haunted him. He could not bear to face her, so he withdrew into himself. Sequoia's mother, too, was devastated. She had lost her own hope for the future. Sequoia's condition reminded her of everything that had been lost. Unable to cope with the change, she became distant, unable to provide the support her daughter so desperately needed. Days turned into weeks, and Sequoia found herself more and more alone. The once strong family, which had been the center of the village, had now fallen apart. The people of the village, too, slowly began to turn away. They no longer saw Sequoia as the young leader with a bright future. Instead, they saw her as a symbol of the village's defeat. In their eyes, she was a reminder of the tragedy, and they couldn't bear to look at her. They whispered behind closed doors, their voices full of pity and sadness, but no one came to visit. No one offered comfort. It wasn't that the villagers were unkind. They simply didn't know what to do. The chief was no longer the powerful leader they had once followed, and Sequoia, once full of life, was now confined to a chair, unable to even move without help. The village had lost its strength, and with it, the hope for a better future. The people were afraid, and fear made them retreat. Sequoia spent her days in silence, her thoughts swirling around the memories of what had been, and the uncertainty of what the future might hold. The world outside seemed to have forgotten her. Her father, once the most important man in the village, now spent most of his days in his hut, lost in his own sorrow. Her mother, too, had retreated into her grief, leaving Sequoia to fend for herself. It was a dark time for the village. Without the chief's strength, the people felt lost. They were no longer united, no longer driven by the hope that had once filled their lives. And Sequoia, who had once been the heart of that hope, now felt like a ghost in her own home. She missed the days when people would gather around the fire to listen to her father's stories, when her mother would sing songs, and when the village was full of laughter. Now there was only silence. The days dragged on, and Sequoia's pain, both physical and emotional, became harder to bear. She felt abandoned by everyone, even the people who had once loved her. The thought of the future felt like an insurmountable wall, and she wondered if there was any way to climb it. But what no one knew, not even Sequoia herself, was that the future was not as bleak as it seemed. In the midst of this darkness, a quiet change was about to take place. Far from the village on the open plains, there was a man who would change everything. He was not a healer or a leader, but a cowboy with a past that he kept to himself. He had no interest in the village or its people. But fate has a way of bringing people together when they need it most. In the coming days, Sequoia's life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The silent cowboy was on his way, and with him, the hope of something new. Something that would bring Sequoia back to life in ways she had never thought possible. But for now, she sat in her quiet house, waiting for something to break the silence that had become her life. Far beyond the valley where Sequoia's village sat, a lone figure traveled across the vast open plains. His name was Luke. He was known to some as the silent cowboy, a man with few words and a reputation for never staying in one place for long. Luke had spent most of his life moving from town to town, working as a guide for travelers or taking on odd jobs when needed. He was a man who preferred the quiet of the land to the noise of people. Luke's life was not one of luxury or fame. It was a life of solitude, a life he had chosen after years of pain and loss. He had no family, no close friends, just his horse, his rifle, and the open skies above. His past was something he rarely spoke of, and his heart carried a weight he had learned to bear alone. He had made peace with the emptiness, or at least that's what he told himself, but deep down he still carried the scars of a life that had taken more than it had given. One day, as Luke passed through a small town at the edge of the valley, he overheard a conversation in the local tavern. The voices were quiet, but the words carried weight. The villagers spoke of the chief's daughter, Sequoia, and the tragedy that had struck her family. They spoke of how she had been left alone, abandoned by the very people who should have been there for her. The chief, once a proud leader, had withdrawn into his own grief, and Sequoia had been forgotten. The village had turned its back on her. Curiosity stirred inside Luke. He had never met Sequoia, but something about her story resonated with him. He had seen loss in his own life, too much of it, in fact, and he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have no one. To be left alone in the world when you once had everything. Luke had learned long ago that nothing in life stayed the same. Everything changed. People came and went, and the land always moved on. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to Sequoia's story than just abandonment. That night, as he lay under the stars, Luke couldn't shake the thought of her. He wondered what kind of person she was, what kind of life she led now. The silence of the plains seemed to call to him, as if the wind itself was urging him to take action. The next morning, without much thought, he saddled his horse and set off toward the village. The journey wasn't long, and soon Luke found himself standing at the edge of the village. The people didn't look at him with curiosity or suspicion, as they had done in the past. Instead, they turned their heads away, as if they had seen enough strangers in their lives and had no interest in another one. The village was quiet, almost too quiet. It was a place that had been drained of its spirit. Luke's first stop was the chief's hut. He had heard rumors of Sequoia's condition and figured the best place to start was with her family. The door to the hut was open, and inside he found the chief sitting alone in the shadows. The man looked older than his years, his face etched with the pain of loss. His eyes, once sharp and full of authority, were now clouded with regret. "Is Sequoia here?" Luke asked, his voice calm but steady. The chief didn't look up at first. His hands were folded in his lap, his posture slouched as though he were carrying an invisible weight. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "She's in the house behind the hut," he said. "But I warn you, she's not the same as she once was." Luke didn't respond. He simply nodded and made his way toward the small house behind the hut. The air around him seemed to grow heavier with each step. He didn't know what to expect, but something in him told him that this meeting would change everything. When Luke reached the door, he hesitated for a moment. He had no idea how to approach her. He wasn't good with words, and he wasn't sure what he could say to make things better. But he knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than any words could. He knocked gently on the door, and after a moment it creaked open. Sequoia sat inside, her wheelchair placed beside the window. She was looking out at the landscape, her eyes distant. She didn't turn to look at him, but Luke could feel her presence. It was like a quiet storm, a force of nature that had been ignored for too long. "Are you Sequoia?" Luke asked, his voice soft but clear. Sequoia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply nodded slightly, her gaze still fixed on the outside world. There was a stillness to her, a quiet that Luke couldn't ignore. She wasn't angry, nor was she sad. She was simply waiting for something to change. "I'm Luke," he said after a pause. "I heard your story." At the mention of her story, Sequoia finally turned her head slightly toward him. Her eyes were sharp, though filled with the sadness of years spent in isolation. There was a quiet strength in her gaze, a strength that Luke admired. "I don't want your pity," Sequoia said, her voice calm but with an edge to it. "The village has given up on me. My family has too. What makes you different?" Luke didn't answer right away. He simply walked over and took a seat near her. He wasn't there to offer pity or promises. He wasn't there to fix her life. He was just there to be. "I'm not here to fix you," Luke finally said. "I'm just here. That's all." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Sequoia didn't feel completely alone. She didn't feel like a burden. She just felt seen. Luke's presence wasn't loud or demanding. It was steady, like the land itself. And for Sequoia, that was all she needed. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. The days that followed Luke's first visit to Sequoia's home were unlike any Sequoia had experienced in a long time. She had always felt like an invisible figure in the village, someone left behind by her own people. But Luke's presence brought a small change to her world. It wasn't anything dramatic. There were no grand promises or sweeping gestures, just the simple act of someone sitting quietly beside her day after day. Luke didn't say much, which, strangely, was what Sequoia needed most. He didn't try to make her laugh or cheer her up like some of the villagers who were uncomfortable with her situation. Instead, he came and went at his own pace, never rushing, never pressuring her. He would sit next to her by the window, sometimes saying nothing at all. Other times, he would quietly ask her about the world beyond the village, about the things she used to love. But no matter what, he never pushed her. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Sequoia found herself looking forward to these quiet moments. She had spent so many years locked in a battle with herself, her thoughts full of frustration, guilt, and grief. She had thought she was beyond help, beyond comfort. But Luke's steady presence, as simple as it was, started to crack the wall she had built around herself. He didn't ask for anything from her. He didn't pity her. He simply showed up. Each day, Luke would bring small gifts for Sequoia, a flower he had found on his travels, a piece of fruit, or sometimes just a hand-carved trinket. She didn't know why he did it. Perhaps he saw something in her that no one else did. Or perhaps he was just kind, in a quiet way without wanting anything in return. One afternoon, as they sat together near the river, Luke picked up a smooth stone from the ground and handed it to Sequoia. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it from him. It was round and polished, the kind of stone you might skip across the water if you had the strength to throw it. "You used to skip stones, didn't you?" Luke asked, his voice low but steady. Sequoia looked down at the stone in her hand, her fingers tracing the smooth surface. It had been a long time since she had done that, a long time since she had done anything with joy. But as she looked at the stone, something stirred inside her. She remembered the days when she had been able to move freely, when she had been able to run and play and feel the wind in her hair. "I did," Sequoia replied softly. "It's been a long time, though." Luke didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His quiet understanding was enough. Sequoia felt the weight of his words, but it wasn't a burden. It was a gentle invitation to remember something from her past, something that she had buried deep inside. Over the next few weeks, their routine continued. Luke would visit every day, and Sequoia would find herself opening up to him in small ways. Sometimes she would share stories about her childhood, about the adventures she had had before the raid. She would tell him about the games she played with the other children in the village, the lessons she had learned from her father, and the dreams she had once had for her future. But other times she would simply sit in silence, and Luke would be content with that. It was during these silent moments that Sequoia began to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She realized that she had been so focused on what she had lost that she had forgotten to appreciate the things she still had. Her memories, her strength, and the quiet presence of someone who cared. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Luke spoke again. "You know," he said, "you don't have to stay here, hiding from the world." Sequoia looked at him, surprised by the words. No one had ever told her that before. The villagers had long since turned their backs on her, and her family had retreated into their own pain. The idea of leaving the village had never crossed her mind. She had always felt trapped in her circumstances, as though her life was on pause, waiting for something that would never come. "I don't know where else I would go," Sequoia replied quietly. "This is all I've known." Luke's gaze softened, and he leaned back against the tree they were sitting under. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go of what's holding you back. But you don't have to face it alone." Sequoia didn't answer right away. The idea of leaving the village, of leaving everything she had known, filled her with both fear and excitement. She had spent so many years feeling trapped, unable to move, unable to escape her own thoughts. But Luke's words were like a key turning in a lock she hadn't realized was there. The next day, Luke came with an idea. "There's a place up in the mountains," he said, his voice casual. "I think you'd like it. It's quiet, peaceful. You can see the whole valley from there. I think it might help you find something you've been looking for." Sequoia listened, intrigued. She had spent so long feeling stuck, so long resigned to the idea that her life had been decided for her. But now, with Luke's quiet encouragement, the thought of something different seemed possible. "I'd like to see it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And so, over the next few days, Luke and Sequoia made plans. It wasn't going to be an easy journey, and there were many obstacles to overcome, but for the first time in a long time, Sequoia felt a spark of hope. She wasn't sure where the future would take her, but she knew that with Luke's help she could start moving forward. She didn't need to have all the answers, just the courage to take the first step. As they prepared for the journey, Luke showed Sequoia how to handle her wheelchair with more confidence, teaching her how to navigate rougher terrain and manage the challenges that came with it. They worked together in silence at times and in small conversations at others, each of them learning from the other. It wasn't a quick process, but Sequoia began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: independence. The day arrived when Sequoia and Luke were ready to leave the village and head toward the mountains. It had taken several days of preparation, but with Luke's quiet guidance, Sequoia felt more confident. There were still moments of doubt, doubts about her ability to travel, about whether she was truly ready to leave behind the life she had known. But Luke's steady presence, his calm words, and the trust he had shown in her, made her feel that she could do anything. The journey to the mountains wasn't an easy one. The terrain was rugged and the road was often rough. Luke was patient, moving at a slower pace to accommodate Sequoia's wheelchair. At times, they had to navigate through thick patches of forest or across small streams, but Luke always found a way to make it work. He would guide Sequoia, carefully lifting her over obstacles when necessary, or helping her to find the right path through the dense underbrush. As the days passed, Sequoia began to feel a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. The village, with its memories of loss and pain, began to feel farther away with each step. The beauty of the open plains and the towering mountains around her began to fill her heart with a quiet joy. She had forgotten what it felt like to be surrounded by nature, to hear the rustling of leaves and the call of distant birds. It was the kind of peace she had longed for but hadn't known how to find. One evening, after a long day of travel, Luke set up camp by a small creek. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the landscape. Sequoia watched the sky, her heart swelling with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. She had spent so many years trapped in the shadow of her own grief, but now she was beginning to see the world in a different way. It was a slow, gradual shift, but it was happening. Luke busied himself with gathering firewood, and Sequoia took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. The silence between them was comfortable, a reflection of the quiet bond they had formed over the past few weeks. Neither of them needed to speak all the time. Sometimes just being in each other's presence was enough. "Luke," Sequoia said softly, breaking the quiet, "why did you decide to help me?" Luke didn't look up immediately. He continued to arrange the wood, but his voice was steady when he finally answered. "I didn't decide," he said. "I saw you. I saw that you were lost, and I couldn't just walk away." Sequoia considered his words carefully. There was no pity in his voice, no judgment. He didn't speak of her as a victim. He simply saw her as a person, someone worth caring about. "I didn't ask for help," Sequoia replied, her voice hesitant. "I didn't want anyone to see me. I thought I was beyond help." Luke paused, looking up at her with those quiet eyes of his. "You don't have to ask for help, Sequoia. Sometimes the help we need comes to us when we're not looking for it. Sequoia didn't know how to respond. There was something in his words, something deep and honest, that made her feel as if she were finally beginning to heal. It wasn't about fixing what had happened to her. It was about moving forward, about finding peace in the present, about learning to trust again. Over the next few days, the journey continued. Luke and Sequoia moved slowly but steadily. Every evening they would set up camp by a creek or under a tall tree. Sometimes they would talk for hours, and other times they would sit in silence, simply enjoying the beauty of the world around them. Sequoia found herself opening up more to Luke, sharing stories from her past, her hopes, and even her fears. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sequoia spoke of her childhood. She told Luke about her father, the great chief, and the pride she had once felt in being his daughter. She told him about the way the village had looked at her, with both admiration and expectation, and how she had always felt the weight of that expectation on her shoulders. She spoke of the dreams she had once had, of leading the village someday, of making her father proud. Luke listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the fire. When Sequoia finished speaking, there was a long silence, the kind that felt comfortable, not awkward. Luke leaned back against a tree, his eyes on the stars above. "You know," he said quietly, "you don't have to carry all that weight anymore. You don't have to be your father's daughter. You can just be Sequoia, and that's enough." Sequoia felt the weight of his words settle over her like a gentle blanket. For so long, she had defined herself by the role she had been born into. She had been the chief's daughter, the one who was supposed to lead. But now, as Luke spoke, she realized that she didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations but her own. She could define herself on her own terms, without the shadow of her father's legacy hanging over her. That night, as they sat by the fire, Sequoia felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of freedom. The village, her injury, her father's fall from grace, it all seemed so far away now. The world was vast, and she had only just begun to understand how much of it she had yet to explore. The next day, they reached the base of the mountains, where Luke had promised Sequoia they would find the peace she had been searching for. They camped near a small lake, the water so clear it looked like glass. The mountains towered above them, majestic and silent. Sequoia gazed up at the peaks, a feeling of awe washing over her. She had never seen anything so beautiful. Luke set up their camp near the lake, and Sequoia wheeled herself to the water's edge. She reached down to touch the surface, feeling the coolness of the water against her fingers. It was a simple moment, but to her it felt like a gift. For the first time in a long time, Sequoia felt connected to something bigger than herself. She wasn't just the chief's daughter, the girl who had been broken by tragedy. She was a person, a soul, part of the vast world around her. Luke sat beside her, his presence quiet but strong, like the mountains themselves. "Thank you," Sequoia said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Luke looked at her, his expression as calm as ever. "You don't have to thank me, Sequoia. You're already strong. I'm just here to remind you of it." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Sequoia felt something stir deep within her, a quiet hope, the kind that had been buried for so long. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a beginning, and with Luke by her side, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next. The days by the mountain lake felt like a dream to Sequoia. The stillness of the water, the towering trees, and the vast open sky all combined to create a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had always been surrounded by the noise of village life, the weight of expectations and the sorrow of loss. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, she felt something different, something new. It was as if the world itself was offering her a second chance. Luke had been patient with her. He never rushed her, never pushed her to move faster than she was ready. He simply stayed by her side, offering quiet companionship. He had taught her so much without saying much at all. He had shown her the power of silence, the strength in simply being present. It wasn't just about getting to the mountains. It was about learning how to be still, how to listen to the world, and how to listen to herself. Each morning, Sequoia would wheel herself down to the edge of the lake, watching as the first light of dawn touched the water. She would sit there for hours, thinking, reflecting, and feeling the weight of her past slowly lift off her shoulders. The world around her was so vast, so full of life. And for the first time in a long time, Sequoia felt like she belonged to it. Not as the chief's daughter, not as the girl who had lost everything, but simply as Sequoia, a person with a future, with dreams, with the ability to start anew. Luke didn't speak much during these quiet mornings, but he would often sit beside her, his presence solid and comforting. He didn't need to say anything. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. He had helped her rediscover her own strength. He had given her the space to heal without judgment or expectation. And now, Sequoia felt ready to take the next step, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. One afternoon, as they sat together on the edge of the lake, Sequoia looked at Luke with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. "I think it's time to go back," she said quietly. Luke turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. He didn't ask why, and he didn't question her decision. He simply nodded, as if he had known this moment was coming. "I think you're right," he said. "But remember, you don't have to go back to the same life you left behind. You've changed, Sequoia. You've grown." Sequoia smiled at him, a small but genuine smile. She had come so far from the girl who had once felt trapped in her own grief. The person sitting beside Luke now was someone who was ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that she could face it. She had the strength within her, the same strength Luke had helped her rediscover. That afternoon they packed up their things and began the journey back toward the village. It wasn't a long journey, but it felt different this time. Sequoia didn't feel as though she was returning to the past. She wasn't going back to the person she had been before. She was going forward, with a new understanding of herself, of the world, and of her place in it. As they entered the village, Sequoia couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The village had once been a place of sorrow for her, a place where she had felt abandoned and forgotten. But now it seemed smaller somehow. The people who had once turned their backs on her were still there, but their opinions didn't matter as much as they once had. The village no longer held power over her. Sequoia had taken back control of her life. She wheeled herself toward her family's home, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She wasn't sure what kind of reception she would receive, but she was no longer afraid. Her father, Chief Tahoma, was sitting by the door when she arrived. He looked up, his eyes tired and worn, but when he saw her, something changed in his expression. There was a flicker of recognition, a flicker of hope. "Sequoia?" His voice trembled, as if he wasn't sure if she were real or a dream. Sequoia met his gaze, her eyes clear and steady. "Yes, Father, it's me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, full of years of hurt, regret, and loss. But in that silence, something shifted. The years of pain were still there, but so was the possibility of healing. Sequoia's father slowly stood up and took a step toward her. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I should have been there for you. I should have been stronger." Sequoia didn't need him to say more. She had heard his apology, but she didn't hold on to it like a lifeline. She had forgiven him long ago, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. "You were there for me in your own way, Father," Sequoia said softly. "And I've learned that I don't need to live in the past anymore. I've learned how to move forward." Chief Tahoma looked at his daughter, his face filled with both sorrow and pride. "You've grown stronger than I could have ever imagined, Sequoia." She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I've had help," she said, glancing over at Luke, who was standing a little distance away, watching them quietly. Chief Tahoma turned his gaze toward Luke, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Luke nodded, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions had already shown Sequoia what kind of man he was. Someone who didn't seek glory, who didn't need recognition. He had simply helped her when she needed it most. Over the next few weeks, Sequoia began to reconnect with the village, but this time, it was on her own terms. She wasn't seeking approval or permission anymore. She simply lived. She helped with tasks, shared stories, and slowly began to rebuild relationships. The villagers who had once turned their backs on her began to notice the change in her. They saw that she was no longer the broken girl who had lost everything. She was a woman who had found her strength, who had learned to embrace the future, not the past. Luke didn't stay in the village long after that. He had done what he set out to do. His work was done, and he knew that Sequoia no longer needed him in the way she had before. He said goodbye quietly, as he always did, leaving Sequoia with one last piece of advice. "Remember," he said as he prepared to leave, "you don't have to carry the weight of the past. You can let it go and start fresh every day." Sequoia watched him disappear into the distance, feeling a mixture of gratitude and loss. She didn't need to chase after him. She knew he had given her the tools she needed to live her life fully. As the days passed, Sequoia continued to grow, continuing to take each day as it came. She had faced so much, but with the help of a silent cowboy, she had learned that her life was hers to live, not defined by what had happened to her but by what she chose to do with it. And so Sequoia walked into her future, strong, independent, and free.